Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Postdoctoral Association's Race and Ethnicity Equity Summit. I'm Tim Kimbis. I'm the Executive Director and CEO of the NPA. For those of you unfamiliar with the NPA, we are the national voice of the postdoctoral community. We're a charitable and educational nonprofit membership association made up of more than 20,000 postdocs and other individuals, as well as more than 230 research institutions across the country. And in just a little over a month, we'll be celebrating our 20th anniversary. Today, postdocs across the country provide innovation, creativity, and leadership to our society's most difficult and challenging problems. And yet, we see the difficulties that postdocs themselves face as our most highly educated workforce, difficulties that the NPA is dedicated to addressing and combating. And yet, we also know that no story is created equal, that for some who come from underrepresented communities, that postdoc route can present even higher hurdles. The NPA's strategic plan highlights diversity, equity, and inclusion as one of its 4 core pillars for action, and promoting DEI is one of our formal core values. We launched this summit to advance the conversation around these difficult issues that are surrounding race and ethnicity and affecting members of the postdoctoral community, and to inspire actions by both individuals and institutions to improve the postdoctoral environment for us all. This summit is intended to cover all races and ethnicities. So even if a speaker focuses on issues affecting one identity, the lessons are intended to apply broadly. Some of the information we discussed today may stem from one discipline, but is intended to benefit all of us covered under the broad umbrella of the NPA. I want to thank and acknowledge those leading institutions who stepped up as allies, as partners, and sponsors, including our lead event sponsor, the University of Chicago, and its wonderful postdoctoral office. Our lead advertising partner, the NYU Langone Health and the NYU School of Medicine, and contributing members of the Big Ten Postdoc Office Group, Mortgage Center for Public Service, the University of Chicago, Illinois, the University of Minnesota, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We also thank our incredible lineup of panelists and moderators from across the country, from academia, nonprofit organizations, and industry, for sharing their voices in this critical discussion. We built this summit around 4 panels to reflect the continuum that is the postdoctoral experience through the lens of race and ethnicity. We start by discussing the pathway of potential postdocs at the undergrad and graduate education levels, as well as looking ahead at some of the larger themes we expect to see throughout the day during panel 1. We then continue on in panel 2, which looks at moving into the postdoctoral position and the challenges that accompany that progression. In panel 3, we dive into the concerns occurring during the postdoctoral period itself. And lastly, we look at stepping out of the postdoc position into those next steps in one's career and the challenges that accompany that transition. Each of these periods is important. Each has its nuances, even as we see common threads develop throughout all 4. The sessions have their own Zoom links, and you should have calendar invites for all 4. In case you have any issues or don't have those invites, note that we'll be dropping the Zoom links for each subsequent session to follow in the chat. And note that after this first session, panels will begin at 10 minutes past the hour and last 50 minutes, ending at the top of the hour, allowing you a 10-minute break in between each panel. This is intended to be a conversation, although mics and cameras are off for participants during the sessions. Please engage by using the chat function to keep the conversation going or to ask a question of the panel. For more information on any of our speakers, you can find their LinkedIn bios connected on the main event page, which will also be dropped into the chat by my wonderful colleague, Amy Wilson. Recordings of the session will be available on the NPA website in the coming days, and additional material on this topic is also available in the NPA resource library that can help advance this conversation even further. We at the NPA chose to make this event free to all to spread the word as widely as possible, regardless of whether you're an NPA member or not. However, if you're not an NPA member already, your membership as an individual is most likely free. All postdocs, students, faculty, and staff members of an organizational member of the NPA can sign up for free on our website. You get access to educational programming, networking opportunities, as well as our NPA resources. You can gain leadership experience volunteering for the NPA, as hundreds of postdocs and administrators have done already on bodies such as our diversity task force. It's easy to join us at the NPA and to volunteer. And if there's representatives listening in from institutions who aren't members yet, please consider becoming one. Our nonprofit work is dependent on the support of our members. In other exciting news, we just opened registration for our 2023 NPA Annual Conference. And we invite you to take advantage of our early bird rates that are out to meet us in Philadelphia on April 21st and April 22nd next year. You can sign up on the NPA website or by using the link just dropped in the chat. More than anything, please remember to bring this conversation back to your colleagues, to your friends, and your institutions to keep progress in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging moving forward. I've encouraged our panelists to be bold, say what needs to be said, and I encourage you to do the same as you carry this conversation forward. You can share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag NPA Equity. I'm happy now to turn it over to our first panel entitled What Comes Before, and it's moderated by Suzanne Ortega, President of the Council of Graduate Schools, and we're thrilled to have Suzanne as an esteemed leader in this field help kick us off today. Enjoy the event.
Thank you so much for organizing this very important session, for the work that NPA does. Thanks to your colleagues, Christy and Amy, for all their support in making this event successful. We are really looking forward to a robust conversation. I will say thanks in advance to my wonderful colleagues who will join us in this opening panel. I want to say that we are going to treat this as conversational and hope that you will too, and that you will feel free to drop in questions into the chat. And after our initial remarks, we'll try to make sure that we get to them. I'm going to do the quick introductions now, refer you to the website for fuller details, and then we will get the conversation started. So I am joined by my colleague Hiro Okahana, who is Assistant Vice President for Research and Insights at the American Council of Education, by Andrea Joseph, who is a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, by James Antony, who is the Dean for Graduate Education and Postdoctoral Affairs at University of California, San Diego. And last but certainly not least, Michael Cunningham, who is the Associate Provost for Graduate Studies at Tulane University. So it's very good to see all of you colleagues. I thought maybe to get us started, I would begin with this reflection. We all know that the pathway into postdoctoral fellowships is through graduate school, and maybe it's even before graduate school. So each of you represents an organizational or unique position and institutional type. So from your vantage point, and in this context of pathways into and through postdoctoral affairs, fellowships and study, what do you see as the 3 or 4 most important actions that we collectively can take now to enhance the diversity of the postdoctoral community? And I will ask in this order, Hiro, for you to set the stage with your opening remarks, move to Andrea, then Jim, and then Mike.
Great. Well, thanks, Suzanne, and thanks, Tom and the NPA colleagues for organizing this conversation. Very happy to be part of this. So I should have first said, what's my vantage point? look like. So I work for American Council on Education, which is a DC-based nonprofit higher education association that represents all sectors of post-secondary education institutions in the US and a few other places. So I guess my vantage point is like, I'm not in trenches at the institution level, day-to-day interacting with graduate students or undergraduate students or postdocs for that matter. ACE positioned itself as the convener of the higher education sector, and we are sort of systems actor in this regard. So, so when I think of this question, some of the things that come to my mind is like institutional level changes are important, and I can think of a few potential examples, and my colleagues on the panel, sure they'll have great ideas. But from my vantage point, when I look at the overall landscape of higher education, in some way, we need something more than the institutional level incremental changes at this stage. We've been at this challenge of broadening the participation in graduate education and post-secondary education for some time, and we've made some progress and a good progress, but also we have like a lot of long ways to go. Some data points at the national level sort of makes me very skeptical and depressing. One example might be that while we increase the participation of students of color and diversify some parts of graduate education, we are still quite behind. The professoriate looks still primarily white, and the graduate student field still is, and particularly quote unquote top ranked institutions where many faculties are being produced. And also, like, coming out of this COVID pandemic, we know that the staff morale and the faculty morale in the universities as a workplace is sort of low at the moment, and persons of color are getting even greater blunt of that hit. So, I mean, all these to say that when I look at it, it's like, okay, so what are the things that institutions can do? I mean, there are things institutions can do to increase participation and improve the recruitment cycles, but in some way that as we continue to have those incremental institutional level changes, we really need to be thinking about systems level disruptive changes. And I do think that a conversation like this one and taking these conversations back and having sort of parallel approach to individual institutions' actions and a collective, more disruptive action is going to be very needed. So I'll pass that to Andrea.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you to NPA for putting on this panel with such an important topic. As Suzanne mentioned, I'm a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania, and I came here with a background in, so my undergrad education was at Johns Hopkins University, and my grad school was at the University of Washington. So I'm speaking from a place of recently being, in these, what comes before the postdoc, and also with the experience of mentoring grad students and undergrads who are making this decision of, the academic, moving forward in the academic path. And when I think about the experiences that I had that made me continue in academia, just to pull out a few of them, I think one important one was being exposed to research and lab experiences early in my career. So as an undergraduate student. And I think one institutional change would be to expand access to these opportunities to people who have been historically marginalized, minority identities, and who might not be represented in these research environments. So expanding summer research programs through the NSF, the NIH, or at the institution level, and also allowing work study in labs. I know that I've mentored several undergrad students who've had to balance lab work with a separate work study appointment. And I know that at some institutions, work study does count as lab research work. And so just integrating that across, being conscious about where your institution is on that would be good. Another thing I've run into while mentoring students is this culture that you should be, students should be expected to relocate, oftentimes move cities or move to a different coast like I did for their graduate training. And I think this is a huge burden to put on students who might be coming from undergrad with significant amounts of student debt. And I think to address these problems of diversity in academia, that is a really important culture shift to really think about what's important about moving institutions, moving cities, and moving coasts, and examining how that can be changed to benefit diversity, equity, and inclusion. And finally, I think another experience that keeps marginalized, minoritized identities out of academia is toxic working conditions. Not only salary, like I mentioned, but also conflicts with advisors and visa issues, things like that. And so I've really seen at the University of Washington, grad students and postdocs are unionized at a growing number of institutions. There exist unions like this, and I've found that these unions are a great way to bring more power to students and postdocs and address toxic working conditions like that. Those would be my suggestions.
Thanks, Hiro and Andrea. I couldn't agree more with everything that both of you said. And I have very little more to add because you said it so well. Let me just say that I do think as we're getting creative about ways in which we as higher education can expand the pipeline to include those from underrepresented backgrounds. By the way, asterisk, I'm going to include women in STEM as we think about underrepresentation here, because it's a huge issue that we absolutely cannot take off our radar screen. Yes, I think we need to think quite creatively about what we're doing at the undergraduate levels. I'm going to say something that I think shouldn't be radical, but unfortunately it is. When we look at higher education labor patterns, we see clustering that largely focuses on prestige and status of institution. And I think that's something that we should confront. We should confront the notion that graduate advisors and graduate programs, particularly at elite institutions, should only look to like elite institutions for talent, for their PhD programs. There are so many fantastic institutions that are producing wonderful students of color, women in STEM, that are not members of the AAU, for example. They might be comprehensive or regional colleges and universities around the country. Many, if not most of these, are minority serving institutions. And yet it's shocking to me, no matter where I've worked around the country, the bias that we as faculty seem to have, perhaps unexamined bias, though I'm not sure that's entirely true, a bias towards selecting students with undergraduate degrees from a very tight array of institutions and institutional types. We need to confront that. The second thing I think we need to do, we're certainly doing this throughout the University of California system, is to ask ourselves whether there is continued utility for standardized tests as part of the admission process for graduate school. I think by the time somebody is applying to graduate school, particularly PhD programs, most PIs, most mentors can look at a variety of other indicators to determine whether somebody has the potential to be successful in a PhD program, other than just test scores. And yet there's a stubborn insistence throughout much of higher education to continue using that as a gatekeeping function. And I think we should challenge that. I also think we have to have candid conversations with undergraduates of color, undergraduates from underrepresented backgrounds. Here's another asterisk. First generation undergraduates. Do you realize if you look at faculty ranks, postdoc ranks, and PhD ranks, you're more likely to see students who have parents with graduate degrees than not. So there's a whole phenomenon here to also be examining first generation students. I think we need to have candid conversations with these students during their undergraduate years about what their opportunities are. We should make more robust pipeline programs that bring them into connection with our postdoctoral scholars, create ecosystems of mentoring where PIs, postdocs, graduate students, and undergrads work together in research environments so that everybody elevates their mentoring and their overall experience. So let me stop there because I know others have more brilliant ideas.
The wonderful thing about going after this wonderful group of panelists, I can just say ditto. But instead of just saying ditto, I want to sort of pull back a little bit and talk more from the sort of 5,000 feet level and sort of talk about representation and self-reflection. I think universities need to think about, be self-reflective in terms of how we present ourselves, in terms of do we have issues of equity, diversity, and inclusiveness on our homepages? Do we have a land acknowledgement on our homepage? Because most universities in the United States were not built on land that was stolen from the indigenous populations here. Think about we can be self-reflective in terms of realizing that most of the departments will not look like the student body that's coming ahead. If we think about students who are going to college and graduate school already, the K-12 population is already majority students of color. And so when we think about this particular population of people who are going to college and graduate school, they're not going to look like us in the academy. And us is the general us. They may look like me, but they may not look like us in the academy. Because we aren't there. But do we have things like, do we require diversity statements for our faculty hires? Do we require diversity statements in our graduate applications? Do we think about diversity, as Jim said, in all of its aspects, in terms of women in science, first generation folk, LGBTQ plus individuals, veterans, and so on and so forth, to make sure that people feel welcome in that as well. And then we also realize that most of our mentors may not share some of these diversity demographics that the students and graduate students and potential postdocs may have as well. And so, these groups are going to look to how are we going to be treated at this institution? Are there university affinity groups where students can sort of think about like, wow, I may be the only one in my department, but I can also connect with folk across campus. They have a sense of connectedness about my culture and my background, and all those kind of things too. And something in there, let Suzanne go to the next question.
Thanks, colleagues, for really setting the stage. I want to just throw in a couple of reflections, and then I will get to the question. So the evidence, Bureau of Labor Statistics, information, Council of Graduate Schools collects, and many sources really indicate that careers in science are much more diverse and much less linear than we once imagined they were. Pathways into next jobs are not unidirectional. They may involve multiple changes and different working groups. So observation one. Observation two is that there's quite a bit and a growing body of evidence that suggests that graduate students and other early career researchers, including postdocs, who are from historically marginalized communities, are becoming less interested, or indeed less interested than their majority careers and their majority peers in academic positions. So here's the question. How should or could preparation for diverse careers be incorporated into the professional development of graduate students and postdocs? And importantly, how might we simultaneously honor the value of those different kinds of careers and balance it with our urgent need for a more diverse and inclusive faculty. So again, in order this time, we'll start with you, Andrea, move to Mike, then Jim and Hiro.
Okay, tough question, but I think speaking to my story here, I actually entered grad school thinking I was interested in industry, and I had no idea what an academic career path would look like and what professors do. And so it was through, I was very fortunate to have a supportive PhD advisor who, did brown bag lunches where there were really open conversations about what being a professor looked like, what the path was, the different possibilities in academia. And at the same time, there were lots of opportunities facilitated by her, but also the department and the university to explore opportunities outside of academia. And so that was what I was initially drawn to. I was attending career workshops, career fairs. There was monthly dinners where they brought in, people at nonprofits and things like that. So for me, it was exposure, keeping an eye out for events and opportunities that did exist. I was fortunate to have at the University of Washington. So I would say that those kinds of opportunities were sufficient exposure for me. And I think the most important thing was having that support from my advisor to be introduced to different career paths and also have that space to learn and be supported in my exploration. So it comes down to, I think, the culture and the environment that you're in. Something that I really appreciate that we do at Penn is every year, in order to be reappointed as a postdoc, you have to complete an IDP, the Individualized Development Plan. And so that is a yearly check-in with your advisor on your career goals, the skills, your strengths and your weaknesses, and having that conversation and how you're planning on bringing in opportunities in the next year. I think that's also a really important reflection for students through this process, and figuring out ways to build it into graduate student training would also probably be valuable.
My path was very similar to Andrea's in that, I started graduate school not realizing I wanted to be an academic. I'm a professor of psychology and Africana studies, and I'm in my 27th year at Tulane. And when I first got here, I said 2 years tops. I said, there's no way I'm gonna stay here. I'm just gonna stay here for a couple of years and go do something else. But obviously it's worked well for me. I'm also a first generation student. So I didn't have parents or siblings to sort of say, hey, academia is sort of the place to do it. I will say though, that I had opportunities to try out different things throughout the graduate school experience. I did an internship one summer in the Department of Community Affairs, where I was sort of working on building sort of the behavioral science research in how the city thought about, or how the state thought about sort of diversity issues in the state. I did an independent study in our Office of Equity and Inclusiveness, because I wanted to also understand more about the inner workings of a university, and especially as an underrepresented person at a university. I said, if I go on that pathway, whether I want to be a diversity representative or not, I knew I would get pulled into that direction. So I wanted to have more sort of those sort of types of experiences. But I also think sort of exposure to folk in diverse careers is really needed and necessary. And I even say exposure in terms of how we show up and be our authentic selves. I was at a graduate studies meeting one time, and one of my female colleagues, who was a graduate dean, made a comment that she said in passing something about her kids. And the grad student said, what, you have kids? Because, they saw her as such a workaholic that they didn't realize you can also be a parent and also be a professor and an administrator too. So sometimes I think talking about what we do beyond this sort of 9-to-5 sort of life sort of helps people know that there are multiple career trajectories, and the opportunities that are available in different kind of areas as well. As a psychology professor, many of my students go into applied careers as well as academia. I've had students who started out in applied careers and realized, wow, you know, this 9-to-5 sort of gig is not hitting it. And I really want to go back and think more creatively about who I am and how to spend some of my time and sort of concentrate on the balance between work and family and all those kind of things, and how academia afforded me that kind of opportunity. And so the piece of advice I always give graduate students is to prepare yourself for diverse careers in terms of having a scholarship record that allows you to have options to go into apply for postdocs, to go into academia, but also some of the applied experiences too, in terms of translating some of the work. There are all types of postdoc experiences too, and postdocs should be individualized in terms of what is the additional training that you're getting in that postdoc. How can that help you to that next phase of your career, whether your postdoc is a policy postdoc, where you may go work for NIH after the postdoc, or whether your postdoc includes some teaching responsibilities. If you want to go to a small liberal arts college and be a faculty member who doesn't have a lot of teaching responsibilities too. So thinking about sort of your whole career in terms of the preparation you have, the exposure you have, but then also for me and my colleagues to show up and be our authentic selves and talk about who we are, what we do on Saturdays. We don't sit in our offices, you know, running statistics all the time. You know, I'm a brunch goer and a happy hour loving person. And that's a part of who I am. And I make sure my students know that too.
Let's see, I think I was next. You know, the economics of higher education and particularly research might make us a little depressed about the possibilities to be creative here, because let's be frank, PIs are creating postdoc positions for very functional purposes, oftentimes very self-oriented purposes within their laboratory environments to get stuff done. And there isn't, in their minds, typically a lot of time, space for their postdocs as they see it, to be able to do these additional things that expand their postdocs' career opportunities. We need to figure out how to confront that. We need to figure out how to create space, I dare say safe space, for postdoctoral scholars to be able to explore the variety of career opportunities that might be available to them. And that's frankly going to be a challenge, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try really, really hard at all our institutions to think about creatively engaging postdocs in the kinds of professional development that we want them to be able to do. The second thing I want to say is that some disciplines do this better than others. And what I mean by that is some disciplines have an easy, comfortable, natural fluidity between the private sector or the industry sector and the academic sector. You see people moving in and out. You see people starting in industry and then becoming faculty, or vice versa, right? We should learn from that. I think that the nature of research funding in the future is going to, out of necessity, the economics of higher education, out of necessity, it's going to rely on private financing, private sector investment in the research enterprise. Some might say there's even more interesting and dynamic research opportunities in the private sector, in the industrial sector, than there might be in higher education. So could we just embrace that? Right now, I still feel like we fight with one another. You're either purely an academic or you're purely in the private sector. Why does it have to be, you know, a dichotomous situation, you know, an either or? So we should pay attention to those handful of academic disciplines that fluidly move people back and forth between the private sector and higher ed. We should explore creatively the possibilities of hybrid appointments between academic sector and the industrial sector. I think there's a lot there if we think creatively about the sharing of IP and the sharing of spaces to allow somebody to be jointly appointed in an industrial setting or a private sector setting and in a higher ed setting. Not enough institutions are being courageous thinking about that. And what's crazy is there are so few tenure track, tenure line positions available. We've got to think creatively about how to produce opportunities for all these wonderful and talented PhD students. Yeah, let me stop there.
So I think agreeing with everybody. And yeah, I think even before the exposure to these opportunities, culture matters. You know, from my own experience, Jim, I think we talked about this a few times. Indoctrination is super real. I went through my PhD in higher ed at UCLA with the full intent to work in the policy area. But by the time I was done, I was applying for faculty jobs. I mean, I wound up outside of the academy, but to this day, I still wonder, like, if I have done enough as a PhD graduate from UCLA, and I teach on the side to kind of try to make up for it. And I attended academic conferences, thanks to COVID, that kind of helped me wane off from the conference circuit. But, still that felt like I needed to be there to sort of prove that I'm worthy of PhD or this academic pedigree part of it. So that, and this is coming from somebody who has zero intent of becoming a faculty. So that indoctrination part is real. Fortunately for me at the time, my faculty was somewhat, my advisor was somewhat non-traditional person in terms of academic trajectory and also like work-life balance side of it too. So that helped me quite a bit in seeing that outside a part of it. So if I think of it like, okay, so how do we work these exposures to professional development outside of the academy? So it kind of goes with what Jim was mentioning about, maybe there ought to be more appointment that cross between the academy and industry. But I would go further to say that how do we do faculty hiring and a promotion that actually promotes more of work-life balance or value broader experience? That right now, the way we hire faculty and promote faculty makes them somewhat of superhuman. And that's part of the challenge. And that sort of hits the two of the problems that Suzanne posed us. One is about how do we value and see the career outside, right? So in that aspect, having a faculty advisor with a broader view and who can support the graduate students and the postdoc trainees to both directions, that's helpful. But the other side of it is like, by making faculty position more human, it will make the academy more attractive workplace for particularly for underserved students of color, because that's the one challenge we are facing. The faculty and the staff morale is sort of all-time low. And it's just going to get even harder to attract persons of color to take lower pay and the harsh work environment. So, in order to solve this problem, it's not just giving more exposure, but there's a compelling reason to think about the ways we hire and promote a faculty in this context.
So I already have a dozen follow-up questions I'd love to ask our panelists, and I will, except that what I really like is for those of you listening in to start dropping your questions in the chat, so that as we go through sort of our predetermined questions, we'll have plenty of room at the end to follow up on some of these really important points that Mike, Jim, Andrea, and Hiro are making. So again, any and all questions are important and welcome. But at this point, let me really kind of pick up on this theme of opportunities and creating opportunities that increase graduate students and postdocs' awareness of the variety of careers We might think here about internships that I think have been mentioned on campus or off campus. But also I think to speak to the divide Jim and Hiro spoke to, what about industry postdocs? We tend to treat postdocs as though they're all academic postdocs, all within labs on universities. But what about industry postdocs or postdocs at national labs or ... So any thoughts on things that work or specific ideas about how to increase exposure of our graduate students and postdocs themselves to think about preparing for the next steps in their careers? So again, we'll do in this order this time, Jim, Hiro, Andrea, and Mike. I'll turn it over to you all.
Thank you, Suzanne. Great question. You know, industry postdocs is a fascinating concept. I think what I'd like to first figure out is what's the difference between an industry postdoc and just a job, right? So you've got a PhD and now you're placed in industry. You've got a job is what it is. I think what makes it an industry postdoc might be the partnership I was alluding to before between an academic institution and that particular private sector organization. So that there might be cost sharing between the two organizations, there might be laboratory space sharing, in-kind contributions, and that fluid passage of the individual back and forth between the two organizational types. I think we can do this because in many respects, we already do have, for example, faculty who engage with their universities to do startup companies and actually bring postdocs and students over to those startup companies. And then we work out MOUs to allow sharing of resources and sharing of revenues, et cetera. So I do think that there's something absolutely there. In a perverse kind of way, I believe increasing the fluidity between the private sector or the industrial sector in science and higher ed, just being very upfront about it through these sharing agreements, will force faculty in higher education to finally accept the idea that their graduate students and postdocs can have careers that are legitimate in either space. Because now everybody's getting something and everybody's working together. So I think we ought to put the foot on the gas and start playing more with this idea of partnerships between the two sectors.
Love that. I think that's great. You know, I guess that my point would be more or less informed as somebody who employed recent graduates, and you know, this Suzanne and I, like, we had a postdoc at CGS. So I think the part that I would add to what Jim said is, I think the intentionality on the employer side is important. If we are going to call somebody postdoctoral researcher or postdoctoral appointment, and not a regular employee or a regular sort of conventional term limited employees, employers need to, and a supervisor need to have somewhat of intentionality in making their experience postdoctoral training. And you know, in that sense, you know, the position that we had, and I somewhat have at AC now too, is really thinking about, okay, this is a sort of internship or extension, some sort of like an experience gaining activity, and not meant as permanent stop. And these people will come and work, but also need to have some professional development opportunities to prepare them for faculty jobs or some sort. So, you know, if we are doing this industry or outside of the academy postdoctoral training, we need to sort of almost to kind of put some key attributes of what makes postdoctoral appointments, so that it is not going to be space where recent graduates can be taken advantage with relatively low cost and very little job security. And that might be a space where NPA can say that, hey, if you want to do postdoc, you need to at least have these things. That's sort of in a way of advocating for that sector and a group of individuals.
Yeah, I really love all of Jim and Hiro's suggestions here, the really promoting the academic industry partnership, thinking about industry postdocs, but also thinking about internships in graduate school and industry funded PhD projects. So I know I think I come from one of those departments Jim was talking about, where there is fluidity in engineering, I think, as a discipline between academia and industry. And in our department, there was a select faculty who had strong partnerships with industry collaborators, and those companies would ask for PhD students to be working with their technologies during their graduate work and potentially come to the company campus for some part of their graduate school. But figuring out how to change funding models to be more permissive of industry funded projects during graduate school, I think that all gets at the point of, really nicely weaving in industry and industry exposure during graduate training.
I'm going to be very concrete because I really agree with everything people have said already. I would say that all graduate students and postdocs should have both a CV and a resume. And so hone in on the skills you're developing as a graduate student and a postdoc in terms of highlighting that on the resume, in terms of expertise in scientific writing, expertise in translational materials, expertise in statistical analysis, expertise in methodological sort of diversity and those kinds of things too. And that way you can highlight some of the things that may enhance a job in industry without a lot of the details that are associated with the CV. And I think sometimes that occurs when you meet with the career advisor, the graduate career advisor or postdoc advisor on your respective campuses, to think about, sort of take a step back and what is it about what you've done? And what are some of those sort of generic things you can put on a resume without all the details that also stand out to industry partners?
Thanks. I think I'm going to pause before moving to a last possible question, because we have one question in the chat that I think is really important, and it speaks to this conversation, or maybe our previous conversation. And the question is this: how do you see changing the academic tenure process to make the work-life balance prior to tenure manageable? As a woman with a PhD in mechanical engineering, it was pretty clear that academia was counter to having a family in the way I wanted. And I am reminded here of a very powerful book, Misconceiving Merit, that just came out that tackles this question. Hiro, maybe I will toss this one to you to start with, and then Mike, Jim, and Andrea, as you wish, chime in.
Well, this is one of those things. If I had a real answer or a productive solution, I'd be in a very different kind of pay scale and or speaking fee. But so some of the things that institutions have taken, and Jim and Michael, you're much closer at the institutions to chime in. But there are some institutions that institute ways to pose the clocks for significant life events like a childbirth kind of things. Though the sort of results of those policies seem to be mixed. Sometimes it does not actually benefit women as much as the policy benefits men, sort of situation too. So have to be more careful around it too. But I think other part of it is I think the part, and this is something that Suzanne, we worked at the CGS, and you continue to work around it. Like how do we really measure the impact of academic work. And there's that part. Like right now, the way most places seem to evaluate so the rigor or that scholarly merit is by quantity and impact factors. That sort of incentivize sort of just to keep producing as much and as quick as possible kind of environment. Like that part of conversations need to change to allow a room for us to consider work-life balance. Right now, the incentive structure in such a way that if you keep going, that's probably the best possible way to do it. So that's one big challenge, I think.
I'm going to say it starts with the university leadership. I'm going to give another example. There was a female graduate, a dean of a law school, who's told her assistant, please send an email out to the faculty. Do not schedule meetings for me on Tuesday afternoons, because that's when I go to my son's softball game. Just that message alone let faculty know that it was okay to be a faculty member and a mom. And that changed the culture, if you will, of that sort of institution. Also, as you're looking for jobs, scour the websites, and people should sort of offer this information up. What are the family leave policies? What are the family policies associated with the university? And how are those things incorporated too? One of the things we've done at Tulane, instead of you having to request to stop your clock, it's automatic now. And so if you give birth, adopt, or foster a kid younger than 5 years old, automatically your clock is stopped, but you have to opt out of that if you don't want that to stop. And so what are the institutions' policies associated with some of those things that makes these sort of things, these natural events sort of natural and occur and as a part of the university culture?
Andrea, I know you dropped something in the chat, but I think you should share it.
Okay, well, I don't have to manage academia with a family right now, but it's something that I would like to be doing in the future. And obviously I've been thinking about how women PIs, several steps ahead of me have felt guilty about taking time out, not guilty, just unable to take a genuine step away from their labs. You can't hold up student graduations. You can't stop lab meetings for 3, 6 or more months. And none of that is really what I would want. And so one way I see to change the system would be to build something like a team lab or a multi-PI group where students have multiple advisors that can easily step in situations like that. I don't know where this idea is being done or anything like that. It's just an idea.
Jim.
Sadly, this set of challenges is not unique to higher education, right? So we see it in pretty much every kind of work setting, every professional setting. And so we've got an endemic, if you will, of overwork and underbalance throughout sort of all professional circles. And I think, first of all, not to get political here, but I think there's a role for federal policy nationwide to help our country think about appropriate leave policies, laws and expectations that force all of us as employers to take seriously the notion of both child care and elder care. I'm in that sandwich generation now where I'm raising children, but also have ill parents. So, there's a lot of folks who have a lot of challenges, and just as a country, I think our values need to be re-examined with respect to how we give grace to one another. I just find it so crazy that we have gone through 2+ years of pandemic where the world of work was completely turned upside down as we know it. And yet here we are now, still, it seems like having learned virtually no lessons about the importance of life and personal life. These At the end of the day, folks, these are jobs. I don't care if you're a postdoc or faculty or everything in between. These are jobs. And, you know, if you are like all of us in this Zoom room and you've been to a handful of retirement parties over the years for people who've dedicated their entire lives to their jobs, you realize that after the retirement party, everybody moves on and forgets about that person, you know? So I don't know why we are so obsessed with the world of work to the point that we're willing to replace what's truly important in life, which is our personal relationships, our family, our loved ones, our friends, etc. It's a cultural issue. We can conveniently blame higher education or law firms or the tech sector, etc. And we should blame them. There's a lot of blame to go there. But when all is said and done, we are all also to blame that we allow this kind of cultural phenomenon to drive us. It's not the same in other countries. You know, it's very, very different in other settings. This is a very uniquely American phenomenon, and I think we need to talk seriously about that. As far as things that we can do in the higher ed sector, yes, more job sharing types of arrangements, as Andrea is talking about. I think we can come up with alternatives to, Hiro was talking about the superhuman phenomenon, like a faculty member has to be good at teaching, research, service, mentoring, they have to do it all. Well, why don't we create different kinds of jobs that all hold equal status? If you're really fired up about teaching and you're a great teacher, then let's create teaching oriented roles that have voting privileges and durable, protections. So the equivalent of tenure. Let's give research-oriented jobs, etc. Why do we create these roles that cause everybody to be pulling their hair out because they have to be good at everything?
Jim, I'm sorry, I have this horrible job, and that is to thank everybody for a lively conversation and wish that we could continue and encourage people to follow up with us individually or collectively. But thanks to all of you for a very honest and robust conversation. Again, thanks to NPA for the work they're doing. And with that, I'm going to say have a good rest of your seminar and day.
Thanks, everyone.